everyone, welcome to Cellular Healing TV. I'm Ashley Smith. In this episode, we are discussing epigenetic resets and cellular repair with respected integrative medicine professor, Dr. Michael Smith. He will talk to us about how in order to get rid of illness and autoimmune conditions, we must first turn off the gene. We'll discover how to revitalize the way our DNA repairs itself while clearing our cells of waste. We'll hear tips on how to strengthen genes, mitigate inflammation, and reverse existing damage. Dr. Mike will also share his top epigenetic resets for people living in the modern world. But before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about Dr. Mike. Dr. Michael Smith is an author, public speaker, and frontline clinician with over 20 years of experience. After a personal 25-year struggle with Crohn's and colitis, Dr. Mike discovered functional medicine and epigenomics and now focuses on complex chronic autoimmune cases. In his practice, Dr. Smith combines the leading edge sciences of functional medicine and evolutionary nutrition with the ancient wisdom and vast experience of traditional Chinese medicine. Dr. Mike is a co-founder of the prestigious Academy of Classical Oriental Sciences, the first 5-year full-time doctorate level training program in traditional Chinese medicine. He is also the primary developer of neurosomatic therapy, a hands-on approach to reducing the way people embody distress, illness, and trauma. Dr. Smith has committed his life to service as a healer, a teacher, and spiritual mentor. This is one info-packed episode, so let's welcome Dr. Pompa and Dr. Smith and get right into it. This is Cellular Healing TV.
Dr. Michael, welcome to Cell TV. This is a topic that I talk a lot about, but I think my goal here for people watching this is, to bring some real hard, light, or real easy to do, but life-changing lifestyle changes they can do to change their DNA, to change their epigenetics. And what does that mean? I've talked a lot on this show about, look, you're not going to get rid of this autoimmune disease or this thyroid condition or whatever it is, unless you can turn off a gene that's been turned on that creates it. Dr. Michael, you experienced this yourself. So start with how you got into this area of epigenetics and all that you teach. And I can't wait, to hear some of this information, because you really do have some really great things to help turn off our bad genes, which, by the way, we all have turned off. But welcome and tell your story, Michael.
Thanks, Dan. I just wanted to say thank you very much for having me on, and I've been checking out your show and what you're doing, and you're a rock star, and thank you so much for teaching doctors, because we all need mentors for sure. Wow. So for myself, I actually got into this back in the mid-90s when I was diagnosed with Crohn's and colitis, and it hit me like really hard. I went from a 165-pound professional athlete to a 112-pound dying guy in the hospital in the space of about 2 months. So that was pretty life-altering. And people in the hospital were basically saying drugs, surgery, and weak and sick and in pain forever. And I was like, I'm going to look for a second opinion. And my version of a second opinion was to study everything on the planet. So I got into Chinese medicine, functional medicine, evolutionary nutrition, and that's about 25 years ago. So now I'm doing what I do now. And I think I've only had to require treatment twice pharmacologically in that entire time. So this way of taking care of yourself actually works. And I've been in medical practice 22 years, and 85% of my patients with autoimmune disease get better following these kind of protocols. So it's, people like you, people like me that are just, keeping our nose in the books and trying to figure it out that are going to make this work for people for sure.
How long ago was that you had the Crohn's and colitis?
I think it was 1994 or 5 when they were first poking around with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I got sick. It was, right around 1999, 2000. So something bad was going on. It's funny. I literally had dinner night before last with Jordan Rubin. You remember his story? I remember it was the book. It was yellow. It was Patient Heal Thyself, right? And it was funny because my daughter was there and she didn't know who Jordan was. And I said, I read Jordan's book years ago, right? And so they pulled on the internet his picture, there he was, like you, right? 100 pounds, shriveled up, and then, there he was in the after. And that intrigued me to read the book. And, then sitting at the exact same table was Dr. Chris Zano, who's also been on the show. And he too had Crohn's. And so here we had three people in the room, myself, Chris Zano, Dr. Chris Zano, and Jordan Rubin, all who were told, you'll die unless you do these treatments. As a matter of fact, part of Jordan's story, and you may not know this, is some years later, I think it was like 2008 maybe, or 9. It was 2009. He was told he had cancer, which he did. And basically you have 3 months to live. That's a true story. Jordan doesn't really put that out there much. But again, understanding what you're going to talk about on this show is really how all of us sitting at that table got our lives back. So let's go to, let's give everyone a 101 in epigenetics, right? Why is this so important? I talk a lot about it, but my goal on this show is to give some people some real hard things here that they can take home and do. But why is this important? And how did you end up, from Crohn's to understanding this?
Well, I think it's, I used to be an engineer actually, so it's my natural tendency to want to reverse engineer problems. So when I first got into functional medicine, my whole thing was, all disease starts in the gut. What's going on with, your microbiome and all of that. And once I got probably a good decade into that, I was like, okay, what else is going on? And then you go, deeper into the matrix of the body. And, I think it's worth saying for people who are unfamiliar with epigenetics that most of us in the developed world, we have the image in our mind that your genes, in my sense of humor, would be like a blackjack dealer at a casino. And you're sitting there hoping for like an ace and a jack, but sometimes you're kind of worried it's going to turn out to be a cancer or maybe Parkinson's. And that gives us a very passive relationship with our genetics, with our family history, with whether or not we've been exposed to toxins, other things like that. So, it leaves us a little bit kind of afraid in the corner with that mindset. And, in the last couple of decades, especially in the last 5 years, and even more so recently with more modernized lab testing, we're having this completely huge revolution that says, your genes are more like the backup drive on your computer, and the epigenetics, which comprise between 45,000 and 50,000 unique enzymes, nutrients, and the chemical pathways that actually rebuild and recode your genes.
That's a great analogy. So your genes that you get from your mom and dad, so to speak, that's your hard drive that you really can't reprogram, right? But the software, that's what you reprogram, right? So it's same with the epigenome versus your genes, as an example.
Yeah, so say the more stress we have, the more inflammation we have, the more sugar we eat, the more alcohol we eat, obviously the more we're around things like toxins or hard radiation and things like that, the more the informational space, or what I like to call the soup around your genes, starts to taste a little bit bitter. And the genes start to say, well, I don't really like how this is going, so maybe I'll reach into the back pocket, so to speak, and try something a little bit emergent, And life is, I think, obviously about adaptability. Yeah. So we're always adapting to new things. We're doing our best. We build skills, we build habits. Some are good, some are bad. So as we get into that sense of adaptability, your genes are adapting as positively as they can. But I think it's also fair to say, we can all get impatient and make some short-term decisions. And when your genes do that, they do things that are sometimes a bit random. And you talk to certain people around evolution, and that's the story. We get hard radiation, random genes, and now ducks get big feet. I question that myself, but at least we have that perspective, although it's still passive. So again, when the genetic system starts to adapt and it's not sure how because of a new pressure or something that's around too many seasons in a row. I know you and I are big fans of seasonal eating. Mm-hmm. So if we keep doing the same thing, mono diet over and over again, the genes start to get kind of itchy or a little bit uncomfortable, and they literally start throwing out random ideas. And depending on what's buried way, way down in your genes, it's anybody's guess what's going on. And now that we can actually test, what are called SNPs or singular nucleotide polymorphisms to see where people are the most at risk or the most susceptible for these things and adjust those pathways, we're having this amazing revolution in confidence. Although I admit we're all pretty new at this, and it's going to take us probably another decade to really be certain of some of these protocols. But I don't know, I'd rather be on the front line with my toe in the water of what's new than sitting in the back row hoping somebody else figures it out.
Yeah, no, I mean, these pathways are very complicated, and we are in the early stages, but it's exciting. It really is, even understanding that we can turn off these genes that are turned on. I mean, for you to fix your Crohn's and colitis, you downregulated and turned off certain genes. right? I mean, and again, we're going to get into some of these things that you did, and that we know can have that ability to turn off the genes. But let's stay down this road a minute. So if you talk to most scientists or doctors, they still believe, though, that you've got diabetes or Crohn's or colitis because your mom did, and there's really nothing you can do about that. I mean, why? I don't get that. Like, why with all this new science, why aren't we hearing more about this? I mean, why is there a sticking point with doctors today with this?
Well, I also teach doctors, so I can just basically say that part of it is the idea of becoming a professional and an expert. We both went through med school. I think I've been at this for 25 years. I'm kind of a learnaholic, so maybe my personality is a bit different, but I can respect when a lot of people who graduate and get the lab coat and their stethoscope or whatever, they want to be done with having to go deep into the books all the time to keep up with what's going on out there. So I think a part of their mind just naturally wants to close that book, and maybe it's a year, maybe it's a decade, maybe it's never, but all we can do is educate, inspire, and motivate people to open their minds and that book back up again. So I think that's just a part of the facility of wanting to feel in yourself that you're an expert, that you know what you're doing. And then there's insurance companies that don't want to pay for these new lab tests right now because there's not enough peer-reviewed studies for them to feel that that's a competent way to manage healthcare. So, that's a bit of a thing in the road. And I live in Canada. We have a relatively social Medicare system, which unfortunately, I think it's very credible, it's very efficient, but it's also, they don't want to spend unnecessary money. So if you go to there to say, I have a thyroid problem, they'll test your TSH. And if it's within, reference range, they'll say it's not your thyroid, unless you want to pay out of pocket for a private lab test through someone like me. So I think it's just that natural kind of stick in the mud mentality where I think we're maybe just mentally and economically tired. And we've lost our sense of passion and interest in what's possible a little bit. But there's so many people like yourself. I mean, with podcasts, with YouTube, with a lot of these other things, all the courses people like yourself and I'm putting out there, it's inevitable that people are going to just naturally go, okay, what is this stuff really about? Yeah. And it's going to be like a watershed moment when everyone's going to say, I can totally see how this works.
So, I mean, people watching this that have gut issues that aren't correcting, maybe thyroid, maybe diabetes, name the condition. Does epigenetics apply to all of these conditions? Most conditions?
Well, what I would say that's really unique is because we can get really into the geek out of, what each of these, magically numbered and coded genes may or may not exactly do or cause trouble or potentially resolve. But what I'm more interested in myself are what are called mediating influences, like inflammatory cytokines and things like that, that actually change the momentum of how your entire physiology works. It's like the dashboard lights of your car. If you had a dashboard light that was just a little bit amber saying, excuse me, at some point I might need a little bit of an oil change, your physiology is going to maybe, you get a sore elbow or something like that. But if your entire dashboard console lights on fire, you're not going to be driving very far. You're going to have to pull over and fix the car. So I think it's just dependent on what the mediating or informational substances are that are going to actually either self-correct or perhaps you could say even self-harm the potential for your genes to express themselves. So my focus mostly is in things like, inflammation and specific nutrients that the body needs in abundance for different kinds of illness. And then you look at something like diabetes, and if you can't rearrange your entire insulin physiology, lipid physiology, a whole bunch of neurological processes, your body is going to remember itself, again with that hard drive analogy, as the genetic self with that metabolism and that immune system kind of mood or problem or idea of itself. So it takes a while to what I call reverse engineer the dashboard lights. And when that's really stable, the information that's kind of prying those SNPs or those genes to cause more problems, they're not getting those wrenches to say, ratchet it up or down. And that gives the chance for us to get in there with nutrigenomics and maybe start to, filter those genes and the way they express themselves in a way that's more favorable. But I've seen it go so badly with people who are, I'd love to hear if you've heard a story about this, where people who are new with nutrigenomics and they throw a new patient into a huge pathway for some specific gene without doing anything else, without, maybe a month of detox and nutrient dense eating and maybe some intermittent fasting or everything else that you need to do to get well. uh, that's almost always gone terribly wrong for people. So for me, it's, it's like systems. Let's take care of the thing that's the loudest, the thing that's the most deficient, and balance all that out. And then we can get in there with like the little, I think of a guy who's trying to fix a watch with a tiny screwdriver. And that's going to take time. I mean, it's been my experience that the old metaphor of the tortoise or the hare, when you're working with nutrigenomics, you want to be the tortoise or the turtle. Slow is the way to win that race.
I give people an analogy of autoimmune and most diseases, how it starts today, of a three-legged stool. Like, meaning these three things are there, have to be there for, you to get sick as a causative factor, right? And if one's missing, you might not get the autoimmune. But the first leg is certain genes get triggered. And the next leg is the stressors, physical, chemical, or emotional, that turn on the gene. And then the last leg is the gut, the microbiome, and its role here. And you put all those things together, it's a perfect storm. If you don't get rid of the stressors, can you turn off the gene really? Meaning that we can do all this amazing work.
I really think that's dangerous, actually, to even try.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we've found clinically. All right, let's jump in. Nutrigenomics, what is it? I remember I loved this film years ago, and it was when this was just really getting popular. And it was a film, they took two sets of mice, brothers and sisters, exact genetic twins, right? And they exposed one group to a chemical. They fed them the same, exercised them same, exact same environments. They exposed this one to a certain chemical stressor, right? It turned on what they call the agouti gene, and those mice became fat. As a matter of fact, the next generation inherited the gene turned on, and they became fat little teenage mice despite their diet. We're seeing that today. I thought that was a great video to understand this epigenetic and how our genes of susceptibility get turned on. And folks, we all have them. We all have genes of susceptibility. It's a matter of, do you have enough stressors to actually turn it on? But in that particular video, this would be nutrigenomics, right? Meaning they gave them methyl groups, certain methyl groups that actually turned off the gene, protected, made the DNA better. Is that an example of this?
Yeah, obviously. I mean, the agouti mice were both for researching obesity on one track, and then they also did for cancer. And I think it was within 2 generations of putting them on an epigenetic reset diet, not only with methylation donors and things, but also just macronutrient ratios. Within 1 generation, their actual physiology was normalized. And I think within 3 generations, there was only about 18% of the mice carried the gene in an active enough state that if they had put them into a high stress environment with the worst possible mouse kibble, they would get fat or get cancer. So for me, I mean, that's everyone's favorite epigenetic story is, look, we bred these mice specifically genetically to be predisposed to obesity and or cancer, and we can prove that they can't get these diseases even if they're prone to it in a way that's like chemically more forceful than anything you would probably see in humans.
So, all right, let's talk about it. What can people do? We all have these susceptibilities. Many people have these genes turned on, and they're saying, hey, maybe this is a reason, I still don't feel well. So where do they start, Michael?
So again, it all goes back to adaptability, and I have a kind of a cultural background that's focused around storytelling. So I like to give people information in the context of something that sounds a bit like a story.
Better way to learn, actually.
I find that to be so. So this is a big mouthful, but I'm not sure if I've coined this or not, but I like the way it sounds. What I find the most interesting right now in my research are called nutrigenomic epochs, or long periods of time in which human beings have been suddenly faced with a completely new environmental series of stressors and opportunities that fundamentally forced us to adapt in a way that actually made us more like us. So the first one I usually bring up to people's attention are ice ages. So when you look at glaciation over the last, say, 3 million years, there's been 9 almost extinction level event ice ages where, basically mountains of snow and ice are coming up from south and north and south and north, squeezing all people, including primates, towards the equator, right? And that's what I call kind of like a bit of a bar fight, because the predator-prey dance is going to get pretty extreme, and then it's going to get pretty quiet. Now, when you have ice ages and you got no rain, you got no trees, you got no house for, whatever humans used to be if we actually were long ago primates. Nobody's able to be sure yes or no, but We can run with that story because science likes it. But what actually seems to be the most credible is called the aquatic ape theory from a scientific point of view, where early primates or early proto-humans went to the ocean following freshwater runoff, again, no trees, no other source of food, and actually started knocking mussels off of rocks and going, wow, this is pretty good. And then one of the only two circumstances in which primates will stay on 2 feet is either to look at, the world around them to smell for danger, or if they're in water. So I could go for hours about this, but when you look at the human adaptive physiology that we have now, we're about 25% porpoise metabolism in the sense of fat storage and things like that, and the rest of us still is pretty much genetically a primate. So I just ask people to take a moment and say, what do you think people ate whenever, however far back you want to go, 15,000 years or 2 million years ago, what did our ancestors eat at the beach? And it would have been a lot of raw fish. It would have been a lot of small green plants growing by moving fresh water, and more raw fish and some sea vegetables. And eventually we developed the habit of naturally learning to swim, learning to hunt in the water. And this is what I bring up as what I would call 2 fundamental opportunities with respect to what I call epigenetic resets. So I can get into those if you like.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, but let's recap. So what you're saying, there was these stressors in our environment that drove us into different environments.
Yeah.
Okay. And then our DNA started adapting to those environments. And so are you saying that what is the point there though? Meaning that we still carry that DNA? Where are we going with that?
So, and again, I'm just going to go with the story that primates used to eat a lot of tubers and fruit and the odd insect, and now these primates are eating a lot of raw fish full of DHA, EPA, and genetically that's pretty new for us, and some of our early ancestors adapted to that amazingly well, and it's actually a medical anthropological fact that our brains have doubled in volume in the last 2 million years, which is the biggest anthropological change in any species over time that we've had any proof of. So there's lots of reasons why that could have been said to happen, but I think from a pure medical standpoint, if you're eating a few pounds of raw fish every day, it's going to change the shape and structure of your brain. It's going to change the way your digestive system works. It's going to change our metabolism more towards ketosis than it would have been towards a higher carbohydrate demand. And that's going to make a massive difference on our capacity on every level. And there is some theory that humans used to have a breeding cycle similar to other animals, and at that level of nutritional density, we started having menstruation every month.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't have any evidence of that. So that's just another theory. So I think it's just another way of saying what an amazing gas pedal for human evolution. And who doesn't recognize the benefit of maybe having a good bowl of sashimi if you're going to a sushi restaurant?
Sounds good. So, and then were there other times, obviously, in history that other types of stressors, I mean, besides ice ages?
Well, I just want to bring up another one because I'm thinking of ideas that bring practical opportunities to the listeners. So by moving towards eating more fish that's maybe more in a broth instead of fried on a barbecue might be better if you're afraid of eating something like ceviche, which is raw fish cured in lime juice, or sashimi, which is basically fish that's been frozen low enough to kill those bugs. But here's another one, and I think this is really a really unique one. So let's say that it's 2 million years ago and you and I are, back at the beach trying to do our best to keep our families happy. And we're off to go hunting for some fish. We're going to probably swim out into the bay and then have to swim straight down into the bottom of the bay, maybe 10, 15 feet, and do some spearfishing and then come back up to the top and then swim back home and, give the food to our family. So what's really interesting about that from a physical, fitness level, when you're actually under physical load, say swimming downwards and then upwards without breath exchange to breathe, it upregulates something called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor, which actually engages growth in the brain and or repair. So now we're living longer, there's less degeneration due to age, and we're just a much more stable, much more intelligent, and much more adaptable species. Now, there's one other example that brings up BDNF for people, which I'm sure you've talked about a lot, is fasting. So there's another epigenetic opportunity because obviously our ancestors had lots of times of feast and lots of times of famine.
Yeah, that's my whole theory, right? It's in our DNA, feast, famine, and our bodies, are set up for that and literally need it.
Yeah, I just think it's hilariously common sense that if you're really hungry, you're going to have to think better. If you're in a situation where you're having to work your butt off to get your needs met, you're going to have to think better. So however the universe works, we get smarter when we have to think better just because of evolution. You know, that's not maybe really technical, but hopefully that gives people a sense of confidence that, you know, it doesn't have to be rocket science to work.
So what do you say about this? You know, if I play devil's advocate, okay, so, you know, there's certain things that we adapt to and it's in our DNA, and, you know, and I can see that. But there's amazing healthy cultures that live where no water is, right? When you go into these areas of Tibet, I visited some of these places in Africa. They get no fish, they get no DHA from fish sources, right? You know, I mean, and very little when they do. And yet, my gosh, some of the healthiest people ever that I've met.
Yeah, and almost all of those people live on certain tubers that are high in precursors for certain steroid hormones that also affect the physiology and growth of the brain and the immune system. So although their diets are higher in carbohydrates in the sense of, you know, paleo always is the best, I think human physiology can adapt to anything if you're consistent. Because when you look at all of, they call like the blue zone, you know, areas where the most long-lived people are, they just have really consistent, holistic cultures and diets and ways of being that are just so consistently favorable over time because of the consistency and the fact that they've been doing it for so long. And, you know, we're all, if you go back through evolutionary past, we kind of, in a way, have all the same evolutionary past. So we've all been through some of those biggest resets already. So we're already prepared in a way, I think, to fit into an Okinawan diet or a Mediterranean diet and things like that. The part of that conversation that I find that gets really stuck for people, say I'll use the example of the Mediterranean diet, which became, I think, labeled as a California diet and something else like that, is, you know, people who are shopping for an idea are a bit impatient. People who are shopping for an idea because they're ill are very impatient. So when we start reaching for these ideas from other parts of the world, we hope we can grab onto those and stuff those into our DNA or our gut or our microbiome and make that work. But when you look at the statistics on people who grew up on, say, a Mediterranean diet, that's 10 generations, and you're talking to a 60-year-old who's lived on the same diet every day of their life, genetically, epigenetically, physiologically. Half the research says that the most of the benefit to these diets is they all sit around the same table 2 times a day and have a really good conversation. So, you know, there's a lot more to it, I think, than just what we eat. Because when people say, oh, I'm going to try this new diet, I hope that changes my genetics, I'm like, yeah, I don't think you can just shop for new genes, and it takes a couple of years to change your epigenetic balance. So what's the idea that we can do this in a hurry is going to get more people dissatisfied and disgruntled because we're not thinking about it in the context of genetics. We're thinking of it in the context of a Band-Aid.
It does take time, and people, you know, lack patience. So, you know, I have to say this. I think the magic here, though, is the adaptation, meaning that we can look at all of these stories, you know, and it's really adaptation, whether even the Mediterranean diet, they were always eating different foods only because they didn't have refrigeration or they didn't have whatever. Things were different seasons. I don't care where you live, things change that force you on different diets, even environmental changes, you know, tragedies, I mean, whatever it is, you know, feast famine forces adaptation, and adaptation changes genes, you know, and you're making that argument. But today, I think one of the problems is we lack the adaptation or being forced to adapt, right? So people are on the same diet all the time because at one point it worked, you know, so we're taking away one of those things that really keep our DNA sharp. You know, let's look at exercise. The only reason you get better is because you're forcing adaptation. And if you adapt, you get better. If you don't adapt, you get weaker. Is that a good analogy?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's one that isn't specific to exercise, but it's definitely going to help anyone who's going to go to the gym, and it's going to help anyone who's trying to lose weight or detox. So let's say, again, from our story of, well, maybe humans used to be primates. We spent a couple of million years learning to swim and hunt and, you know, had some scavenging adventures off into the, you know, the land as the ice ages receded. I've got a lot of personal experience of actually taking people out in the bush. I used to teach wilderness survival skills and primitive skills and stuff. So again, imagine, you know, you and I, you know, say 200,000 years ago, and we're off into the new world where we're migratory. We're trying to find new sources of food, new ways to live. And I'll do like a yin and yang example. So a yin example would be water. I don't know if you've ever done any really low-tech camping, but the hardest thing to carry around for most people in the bush is water.
Hmm.
So when you look at the physiology of human beings, we're obviously going to need close to about 2 liters of water a day for optimal, elimination and just overall hydration. So if you're looking at, again, migratory humans a long, long time ago, the easiest thing is to just drink most of your water in the morning, because you can carry that all along in your belly, because, well, you don't happen to have, any kind of plastic thing you're going to carry it around with, and nothing has wheels, and you have to carry your kids and your weapons and everything else. So, and also, I mean, I used to hunt a lot, so you don't walk around with a canteen sloshing with water in it. So, human beings have evolved to actually require a certain amount of water first thing in the morning for optimal physiology. And if you're okay with this, I'll do a little dance pantomime for your listeners and your viewers, because it'll be a bit funny.
Do it.
All right, so I'm going to pretend that I'm your liver. And I'm your liver, and I'm in there for millions and millions of years, and every morning I'm expecting to take all my night's work of turning fat-soluble toxins into water-soluble molecular waste. And here I am with my little liver hands, holding my hands underneath your happy stomach going, where's the water? This has been going on for millions of years. I want my water to get rid of these water-soluble toxins so I can get back to work for the rest of the day. Now here we are nowadays, and I put my little liver hands out after a good night's work, and I get an Egg McMuffin and some really bad coffee. So I'm trying not to swear at the rest of the body here, but I'm like, fine, I'll do all the work to reverse this and put it back into fat-soluble storage, making the whole body more congested, causing what I would call a certain initial epigenetic stressors toward methylation dysfunction, inflammatory status, nutritional deficiencies in certain ways. Because if the liver is always going, where's the water, and it's never getting it, it's going to get really, really upset and have to adapt in a negative way. And this is a really cool fact I picked up a couple of years ago. There's 3 countries in the world right now that if you're in the hospital, especially in the ICU, they'll make you drink that water first thing in the morning. And if you don't do it, they'll just put it into your IV as saline, because you're getting 1/2 postoperative infection, 1/3 postoperative stay. Right? And this is an amazing opportunity, but all we have to do is go, oh, maybe I'll get up in the morning and just start off with start with like just 1 cup of water, work up to 2. If you can, work up to 4. It takes a few weeks to get used to that kind of water in your body at first. So it's going to, you have to urinate more at the beginning. But every person, myself included, that's done this feels like they've lost about 5 years off of their complexion and their body, but most importantly, how they feel on the inside, because now your body isn't having to keep stuff things under the carpet of your liver and then your adipose tissue, and now your poor brain sitting on top of this basic burning tire, fire of burning tires, just trying to keep itself alive. So that's not what I would call a high adaptive environment. That's a highly erosive environment.
What's funny is I drink my water in the morning, and I don't drink much throughout the day at all unless I'm thirsty. Honestly, that's when I drink my water. So that's your first tip right there, is drink the water in the morning.
Tip number 1 is try and get that first liter in there for first couple of days. And if you want to have some fun with it, do your little liver dance, because think it's like a qigong exercise, because the more we embody our intentions, the more we actually enact our belief and our will, the more we sit there and sip at it going, God, I hope this works. This guy may be kind of a crazy person. The less, we're back in that place where we're passive, right? And I think that's the least adaptive state for any human being, is to sit there in the corner going, hope somebody figures this out while I'm sweeping this crap under the carpet. Right? So I really try and motivate people to get really, really engaged and really, really involved, because, this is going to sound maybe strange, and we've just met, so I hope this isn't too weird, but given my cultural background, I think we're all a little bit of a shaman. And, if we more engage in the idea that, our purpose, our belief, our hope, our prayer, our mindset, that's going to have a massive effect on everything, especially your genetics.
So I want to get more into some of those, really, lifestyle tips like that can affect our genome and protect our DNA. But before we do, I have a hard question. 50% of my audience, I'm making up numbers, perhaps don't believe that humans came from apes or primates, and the other half probably does. Does this theory still hold up if you don't believe that?
Well, your liver still has to do the fat soluble, exchange to water soluble, tissues.
The water thing. I wasn't talking about the water thing. I'm talking about the whole thing, how you brought it back to primates and the whole theory came out of that.
Yeah, I'm just saying that whoever designed the universe and whoever made humans as amazing as we are, they made the P450 cytochromic system work the way it does. And that's what I'm speaking to. Because I'm usually speaking in a more scientific kind of educating doctors thing, I would use something like evolution, but I'm not attached to that as an ism or as a belief. It's just a way to tell a story.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's why I asked the question, because I just don't want people to stop listening. I'm always sensitive to different beliefs, right? It's like, and I always tell people, like, I don't want you to believe what I believe.
Yeah.
If there's a truth here, if I bring up my beliefs, Christianity beliefs and, in Christ, and that stops you from listening, oh my God, I don't want to do that. So, okay, now let's talk about just some of the, the different things. Water, drinking in the morning is one of them. So what are some of these other simple lifestyle things that people can do to protect their DNA, repair their DNA?
Yeah, so I kind of made a yin and yang idea. So if water, from drinking it in the morning, is a good idea, let's look at an example of fire. And nowadays we have what people call sauna. In my culture, we have sweat lodge. Pretty much every culture in the world that isn't living near the equator has found a way to basically force the temperature of the body to go up. Part of it was to stay warm, but eventually it actually became kind of a celebration of health and a chance to, hang out and tell stories and do other things. So when you look at the physiology of what happens when the human body is in an environment above 140 degrees Fahrenheit, you see some profoundly amazing things happen, from the dissolution of immune system complexes, which are one of the most erosive things in autoimmune.
Yeah.
The decongestion and formation of unnecessary lipids, because when the body temperature goes up, those substances which are a bit waxy are more melty, and that's as unscientific, but it's easy to say as I can. So the body can mobilize them through membranes more easily. When you look at what are called heat shock proteins, when a person is consistent with that kind of an opportunity to get their body temperature up, even if you're only doing it once or twice a week, you can see about a 15% reduction in all-cause mortality. And that's, like, to say that out loud feels kind of arrogant, but that's the scientific research is 15% reduction in all-cause mortality, from cancer to epigenetic dysfunction to anything else, because these people keep elevating their body temperature. So however it is that we came across that habit, that I believe is a profoundly effective habit.
Yeah, so I get in my far infrared sauna. I also have a Juve light, which uses near infrared, and that really goes deep and creates exactly what you're talking about. And then I think that there's a place here in Salt Lake down the hill from me, because I live in Park City, so we call it down the hill. It's U.S. cryotherapy. They have the one where you get in the cold, right, the whole body, because most of your cold receptors are from here, as well as heat receptors. And then you go from that to the Juve. So you go from cold to that deep hot. And again, what are we doing? It's adaptation again. We're forcing that adaptation that creates, studies show, right, raises growth hormone, norepinephrine. You dig into this body fat, that you typically can't even burn, all to save your life.
Yeah, so I think the next one, and I'm sure your listeners and viewers have heard you speak about this, and it's up to you how much deep or not you want to go into it, but either intermittent fasting, regular fasting, anything that has to do with any tradition that encourages you to limit your caloric consumption in any number of ways are all favorable adaptations. And the more consistent you are, the more longevity you're going to get from that. And I would say the more correction you're going to get epigenetically over time. Absolutely. Because your epigenetics has a kind of momentum. And until we can stabilize that momentum, I would call it erosive instead of adaptive. But when you're consistent enough with those habits, the momentum goes from erosive to neutral. And then hopefully with maybe some lab testing and some more specialized protocols, you could be more accurate. But either way, you're still going to get to that place where the pressure becomes an adaptive positive. And if you can keep running with that, or meditating with that, or whatever you want to do with that, you're going to keep getting healthier and relatively younger in the sense of how you respond or adapt to the world. And I think that's I think the most common sense thing is that when you start waking up in the morning and you roll over to talk to your spouse, or you're taking care of your kids, or you're doing your morning emails to figure out what the rest of the week's going to look like, when you feel sharp and creative and focused, and you can associate lots of different things together to solve problems, that's, I think, what we think of as when we think of relatively youthful, because in our culture, what relatively old means is tired, forgetful, slow, weak, frail, and all of those things, or on 15 medications in some kind of care facility. So we all have, I think, an actual instinctual aversion to that possible future, and that in itself is a kind of stressor. I'm afraid of who I'm going to be. So the more empowered, educated, and consistent we are, the more that proactivity is going to actually just make you become more you. And I'm going to say this because, I have a spiritual faith as well. Everyone in your life, they want the most of you that they can get. And I mean, when we start to feel sick, we start to feel shy. When we don't look perfectly well, we start to feel shy, and we start to find ways to maybe not be our full selves in the world. And I can't think of a less adaptive stature of any human being than I feel less of me, and I want to hide a little bit. So if we can find ways to give people that courage, that confidence, the chutzpah to try something new and stay with it and get that momentum, to get that clarity, to get that energy in the morning, to get that, hope this is an appropriate thing, but that mojo back in your love life. I mean, that's when we're like, okay, this is worth the change, because I'm more me and the people in my life are getting more of me. And that ripples up because people start saying, like, my son's like, okay, Dad, I'll try that. That seems a bit weird. And, he's a fitness buff now. He's in the gym 3 times a week. And, why is he so happy? Because he put it into practice and he sees it working for him. So sometimes I think we have to be a little the beacon, in the firelight of our family by not just worrying about ourselves, by seeing what we can do, and then, seeing that ripple out and mirror back. Because somebody's got to be the first pioneer with this stuff in every new group or every family.
Yeah, I mean, so, it really is tapping into Bruce Lipton's work, right? He was one of the first to say our thoughts, right? And that's what you're talking about, right? Positive, negative, things that drive our thoughts and how we feel. That is basically affects our cell membrane. The cell membrane is ultimately in what's communicating with all of these vibrations, energies, hormones, all of it. And thoughts release certain wavelengths, and the receptors on the cell pick up those wavelengths, and the membrane is in charge of changing the DNA for better or for worse. So he said, his book is The Biology of Belief. Meaning that
I wish he would have called that The Biology of Attitude or Coherence or something, because a lot of people take belief as kind of a dissociative thing, but I could run with belief. But if I had a chalkboard, I could actually go one level deeper into what you just said about what we would call a surface tension vortex in the fluid of the actual membrane of the cell, because that's how these, the peptides and the receptors activate the cells. So when you're looking at the heart torus, which is Bruce Lipton's big, leap in epigenetics and physiology and evolutionary, I would say evolution, but just how we actually adapt to the world. His whole thing is the coherence of your actual bioelectric field around your heart, and how that changes, like you said, the bioelectric field around the cell, but allows the receptors to actually become like a higher traffic zone to get nutrients in and wastes out. Mm-hmm. So it's really all about flow. And when you talk about Chinese medicine, that's pretty much all we talk about is circulation and flow.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like, crazy for people. Like, what do you mean our thoughts can actually change our epigenetics? Absolutely. And read Bruce's book. I mean, it really does. The science is all around it. I mean, our thoughts, no doubt, will, can change us to become someone new. When your thoughts drive the receptors, which you call, integral membrane proteins, which basically tell your DNA what proteins to produce. Those proteins is who you are, right? You produce certain hormones that make you feel a certain way, act a certain way, and you become a different you as you change your thoughts, right? And listen, I mean, when you look at whether Tony Robbins' messages, everybody, you become the world, how you think your world is around you. You do. You literally start to epigenetically start to produce different proteins, and you become either healthier or sicker, either more positive or negative, more successful or not. And really, it starts with our thoughts.
Yeah, and if it's okay for me to take a moment to speak to the Christian faith, I can't think of a more beneficial affirmation to the human endeavor than what we would call Christ consciousness, not only with respect to how we are in the world, but how we are to honor our life in this body and how we move through the world within it. Because that attitude of compassion, loving kindness, patient, caring for those in need, I mean, that's the most, to be generous is to be generative. to be generous is to focus on what grows and builds and repairs. So the more we're, living in scarcity and worry and my family, not your family, my race, not your race, those attitudes typically make people, just more stressed in a way. So I'm a big fan of all spiritual faiths all of them, because all of them, almost all of them, have the attribution of we have to take care of each other and be good in the world. So I think with that attitude in itself, I can't think of a healthier start to your day than to wake up and say, how can I be good in the world to everyone I meet in some way?
Yeah, I agree. What about specific nutrients? Is there anything that stands out when people look at, affecting our DNA and our genome?
Well, I would say my big start for most people is mediating inflammation. So, obviously getting off high inflammatory triggers, alcohol, sugars, overly highly processed foods. Unfortunately, barbecue is not that good of an idea, at least not that often. But anything to get rid of inflammation is a good start. So I would say start there, and then start looking at some of the most amazingly beneficial, inflammatory mediators like vitamin D3. I always recommend people take that 3 times a day for at least 3 months, because vitamin D, although we call it a vitamin, is actually an immune-mediating hormone, right? So if you get that hormone in your body 3 times a day, along with other mediators that might be more specific to your actual condition or your epigenetic situation, you're going to change everything. And I'll give you guys a fun analogy for this, because I think science is great and geek outs are fun, but I think sometimes we need to see it in the real world. So. And because we live in a pretty PC world, I'll try and make this a bit funny, but in a kind way. So let's pretend that I'm describing a Simpsons cartoon, because then I can be a little bit unkind, but make it funny. So here's a Simpsons cartoon, and it's a construction site, and it's full of young men who've never worked in construction before. They're all 20-year-old. They're full of testosterone, and they're armed with power tools, and they're ready to go to work. And they're supposed to go and build a house, like you're supposed to repair your body. So if they're out there trying to do this and they're not really well informed or very well regulated with what they're going to do, you could kind of, with a Simpsons cartoon analogy, see it going pretty funny. But once you bring the older guy in there with the clipboard and the white hat and everything else, saying, okay, my job is to make sure the tools go here, the lunch happens over there, and no, there's no barbecue, and there's, no parties and no beer pong, then you're going to see the construction really happen. But if you only have vitamin D once a day, especially you're in a highly autoimmune inflammatory state, your body will take that adaptively and say, oh, that's going to be really useful later in case I'm in worse trouble. And it'll store it in your kidneys, right? But if you have it 3 times a day, after 4 days, and we've done some really interesting research on this, after 4 days, your immune system says, not sure how we did this, but we grew a new gland that's secreting this adaptive hormone that's keeping the whole construction site working. So let's run with that. You keep that going for about 100, 120 days, you're actually going to see a downregulation of what are called memory B cells. Now that gets pretty complicated, but those B cells basically will either engage the cytokines and a bunch of other mediators in the immune system to be more aggressive or be more dormant. So I call them the bounty hunter cell, because they walk around with a wanted poster and a gun or an antigen tag and the ability to express about 100,000 of themselves per second in a highly active environment. So again, you're taking that, vitamin D3, K2, maybe what's called golden milk, which is a turmeric concoction that's highly anti-inflammatory.
Drinking golden milk right here.
Nice. Yeah, there's actually a recipe that I produce for people. It's on my website. You can get it for free. And it's medical grade. It's a bit fiddly to do it the first couple of times. But once you get through the process, you're going to get, based on scientific estimates, 8,000 times their curcumin's bioavailability to your cells with that formulation than just taking some turmeric and pepper and going for some tea. So either way, there's, I think, 56 known anti-inflammatory supplements that would be a good idea for that first 3 months, 4 months to downregulate those B cells so that the bounty hunter isn't, telling your whole body that you're in a war and you should shoot at everybody. Because I've seen this happen for 22 years since I specialize in autoimmune disease. It takes about 100, 120 days for everyone to just go from a certain kind of reactive status to a relatively dormant status. And then you see the repair process just start to take off. And obviously age and other factors are going to be a part of how you see that. But that is my experience. It's like, that's like step one. We need to get you to that first 4 months, get your immune system to stop being the enemy, get it back to an adaptive threshold, and then we can get more precise with what we're going to do after that. But then that for me is always step one.
Well, okay, yeah, and that is step one. Do you have give them your book and how they can read more about step 2, 3, 4?
Well, my book is actually, my first book that's out right now isn't actually about that. The first book I have out is called Returning to an Ancestral Diet. And it's basically just saying, okay, everyone, look at your ancestors, look at how they got here, and try and eat more like they did before industrial culture. And if you're more unwell, go back to when they were like really healthy homesteaders, like, most societies started, where if you're going to have any grains and things like it in your diet, or some dairy products in your diet, you're going to balance them out with naturally fermented vegetables, making sauerkraut or kimchi. So I think that, in terms of what that book's about, that's adaptive threshold number one is, could you thrive on a healthy homesteader diet, which is, maybe 60, 70% plant-based, lots of good animal proteins, lots and lots of animal fats, a little bit of maybe those grains and old school breads and, maybe some those kind of pastas and stuff, but maybe the old way balanced out by those fermented vegetable probiotic foods. You go back a little bit farther again in that book, you're looking at what I would call the real paleo diet. And I can get into that more detail if you want. And then you go back and I make the joke, and I have my sense of humor, I can't help it. I actually came up with the idea of the Ice Age diet to make a little bit of fun of the idea of a paleo diet, because people grab onto these titles and then we end up having some kind of conflict over who's right about, history. So I just like to be a bit tongue-in-cheek and say, well, I like the idea of an Ice Age diet because it's about anti-inflammatory. So if anything's going to be the opposite of fire, it's ice. But that book, The Returning to an Ancestral Diet, it's 600 pages. It's got 500 recipes from around the world. But the focus on that is just for general health. If you want to get well, start going back in time to what your ancestors were doing before we ended up with all these problems.
Yeah, that's the book that I have. And do you have a website as well?
Yeah, my website is integrative.healthsolutions.ca.
You enjoyed the article in Scientific American. It was July issue. And it's basically the real paleo diet. And it's pretty cool because it backed a point that I always make. It wasn't what they thought. It was a very varied diet, where they were eating times of meat. And then there was times of more plant-based and times, and again, what drove that? Stress, environmental, lack of food, right? And the adaptation. Anyways, it is a great article. I think you'd enjoy. Well, Dr. Michael, we're out of time. That was great. And thank you for being on Cellular Healing TV. I appreciate it. And you're going to have to go to his stuff, folks, to get step 2, step 3. But that's great. Great stories. People learn from the stories. So thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for the opportunity, Dan. Great to meet you.
Absolutely.
Well, that's it for this week. But before we go, I just want to talk to you about cytodetox. Did you know that long-term exposure to toxins affects our metabolism, behavior, immune system, and can also lead to disease? Toxins like environmental pollutants, cancer-causing chemicals, preservatives, pesticides, heavy metals, and industrial waste are stored in tissues and cells throughout the body and brain, often for years. Cytodetox is a powerful detox supplement that can help you safely and naturally support your detoxification systems and flush away the toxins you encounter on a daily basis. All CHTV listeners can go to buycytonow.com to discover the science of cytodetox and what makes it different from all the other detox products on the market. That's buycytonow.com for more information or to purchase. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll be back next week and every Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern. You may also subscribe to us on iTunes or find us at podcast.drpompa.com. Thanks for listening.